One of the main components of a literature review will be actually writing. And so there are many, many things to say about academic writing. Here I'm going to focus on a few high-level structural aspects of writing literature reviews. The first one is to basically get a good overall view of what are you doing when you're conducting a literature review and writing it down. In my mind, what you're doing is you're taking a complicated network of evolving research, some of which might be conflicting, and you're essentially squeezing that through your brain in order to create a coherent linear narrative. So if we think about that for a moment, it can become quite obvious that there is no one correct way of doing this. There is no single correct literature review that would come out the end of this process for a given topic. There are many, many equally valid and equally good literature reviews which could come out of doing a literature review on any given topic. And so that, of course, is the challenge of doing a literature review. It will be up to you in order to kind of focus on some topics rather than other topics, to emphasize some aspects over another, like are you interested in the historical development of ideas, or are you interested in outlining the methodology used, for example. Nevertheless, I think having this kind of overview in your mind explicitly is kind of good, because it allows you to think, well, there is no one correct outcome here that I'm aiming for, and I don't know how to get it. It's you are doing this kind of highly personalized, kind of high-dimensional task. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about here is to think about the structure a bit of the literature review. So what I've done here is to provide an example. So let's say that you were interested in three main things. Let's say you're interested in body mass index, you're interested in impulsivity, and in exercise. Well, this now kind of creates many possible combinations of things that you could talk about in your literature review. So you could say, well, what do I know? What is known about body mass index? What is known about impulsivity? What is impulsivity? How do people measure it? And equally, you could say, okay, what are the forms of physical exercise that people can have, either just walking around, or if they're doing particular sporting activities? How are these things measured, perhaps? That's fine. You've got three topics. You've just talked about three things. But then why are you talking about those three things? This is where you start to get a bit of a combinatorial explosion. So what do we know about the relationship between impulsivity and body mass index? That's probably an entire other kind of mini lit review. There's probably a whole bunch of stuff there which isn't included in any of the other three kind of boxes that we've talked about. Similarly, you've also got, well, what do we know about the link between body mass index and exercise? Again, a whole other topic. Also, well, what do we know about impulsivity and exercise? So you can see here that if you have the seemingly modest task of talking about three core topics, in this case, body mass index, impulsivity, and exercise, you've actually gotten to this situation where you've got 6 possible kind of things to talk about. And so it's going to be up to you to decide, are you going to talk about all of these things? If you do, how much emphasis are you going to put on each of these boxes? Are you going to treat them all as totally independent things, or are you somehow going to connect them together in a certain order that makes sense? Now, there are no kind of right or wrong answers here. It probably depends on the particular literature review you're doing and your particular goals. But I think the point that I'm trying to convey here is that you should really focus on simplicity. You can imagine that just adding in one other kind of topic here would make the number of things, number of possible combinations of things to talk about start to get really quite out of hand. And so if you can keep the number of core topics minimal, or perhaps just think through cleverly how you're going to structure this, it can not come across as many separate things when the reader is going through your literature review. Another just quick tip that I'd recommend is essentially don't think that you will just sit there and write your literature review from start to finish. I think maybe there are some people who can do this quite well, but personally I think that this is a bad approach. If you start writing in really nice, kind of clear, understandable form, and you've got pages and pages of content, and then all of a sudden you kind of realize, I really need to emphasize this, I need to de-emphasize that, I need to restructure this whole thing, you can get some kind of mental inertia because you have spent so much time writing this. Then you can become reluctant to change. Instead, what I would recommend is to think about your writing in much more of a iterative approach. And so personally, I would say, yes, start writing early, but don't just start writing full text early. Instead, start outlining early. We'll probably have a complete video on what outlining is and how to do it. But the core essence is, once you have identified, the core set of topics, you can write these down in terms of phrases or brief sentences. And if you have this in some document, it is now much easier to move these things around. So you might read through these sentences and kind of think, well, I thought that sounded logical when I wrote it, but now I realize there's a missing step in the logic, and so I have to rejig my structure. You're going to be much more willing, and it will be much more easy to do that if you are doing that in the form of outlining, because you haven't put in this big time investment in writing lots of beautiful prose that you just don't want to delete. So those are just a few kind of large-scale tips about how to kind of approach the writing, but we'll have other videos on writing in more detail.